December 1942. The skies over Buna, on the eastern edge of New Guinea, still belonged to Japan. For 13 months, every American pilot had learned the same brutal truth. Meeting a zero meant standing one step from death. The A6M, light and impossibly agile, carved through the air like a blade, shredding P-39s and P-40s in every engagement. But on the morning of December 27th, something unfamiliar appeared on the steel mat of Loki Airfield. Long fuselage, twin engines, twin booms, a shape that didn't look like anything in the Pacific. Japanese pilots had heard rumors, nothing more. No one knew that today, this machine would end the era of zero dominance. At 26,000 feet, above a Japanese strike force of nearly 40 aircraft heading toward Buna, 12 P-38 Lightnings held a position the Zero could never reach. This wasn't just the first encounter between two fighters. It was the moment air combat changed. From horizontal turning battles to vertical warfare, where speed, altitude, and firepower dictated who lived. Within minutes, as the Lightnings plunged downward like falling stars, Japanese pilots would understand something they had never imagined. They were no longer the hunters. In late December 1942, the air above eastern New Guinea hung heavy with heat and the constant noise of war. Across the jungle, where insects, humidity, and artillery blended into one endless sound, Allied forces were holding on to narrow strips of land against a Japanese advance that had dominated the Pacific for more than a year. For American pilots stationed at Port Moresby or at the forward strips of Dobadura and Popondetta, the sky was not simply a sky. It was survival. Whoever held altitude lived. Whoever lost it died. And for 13 months, one fighter had defined that survival. The Zero. Since Pearl Harbor, the A6M Zero had rewritten the rules of air combat. Its turn radius, its lightweight, its ability to climb quickly at low and medium altitudes. These were not just technical traits. They were the foundations of Japanese supremacy. American pilots had no real answer. Not in the P-39 and not in the P-40. Not in anything they had fought with so far. Until the end of 1942. Captain Thomas Lynch and the pilots of the 39th Fighter Squadron understood the truth with painful clarity. They had seen P-40 and P-39s torn apart in turning fights they could never win. Surviving pilots often remembered only one thing. If a Zero gets you into a turn, the fight is over. Japan's pilots were experienced, disciplined, and confident. Many had survived brutal campaigns over China and Southeast Asia. They came into New Guinea with hundreds of hours of combat behind them, some with more than 1,000. American pilots rotated in and out like the tide. Japanese veterans stayed. And the question that haunted American airfields from Guadalcanal to Port Moresby was always the same. How do you break the Zero? No one had the answer. Not until a strange silhouette rolled onto the mats of Loki Airfield. In the thin morning haze, a twin-engine aircraft taxied across the field, casting two parallel shadows that stretched across the ground. It looked nothing like the single-engine fighters the Americans were used to. The P-38 Lightning, two engines set forward in long booms, a cockpit pod suspended between them, twin vertical tails, a design so unusual that ground crews joked it looked like two airplanes welded together. But what mattered wasn't the shape, it was the numbers written into the metal. 414 miles per hour maximum speed, 44,000-foot ceiling, a 20mm cannon and 4.50 caliber guns, all mounted in the nose with no convergence issues. Turbo superchargers that kept full power above 25,000 feet. From the first moment they saw it, American pilots understood. This was the machine built to break the Zero. Not by outturning it, but by fighting a kind of battle the Zero couldn't survive. A vertical battle. To understand why the Lightning mattered, one must understand the battlefield of the Solomon Islands in New Guinea. Japanese fighters operating from Rabaul had dominated the region. Zeros escorted bombers, intercepted American supply convoys, and shredded P-39s and P-40 before they ever reached altitude. Japan's tactics, refined through years of combat, focused on fast climbs at low altitude, tight horizontal turns, staying on the opponent's tail, killing with short, precise bursts. It worked. It always worked. But American pilots began to notice something important. The Zero was unbeatable in a turn, but vulnerable in the vertical. The problem was that no American fighter had the climb rate, the ceiling, or the firepower to exploit that weakness. The P-38 changed everything. When the first P-38 pilots arrived in New Guinea, they received a briefing that would become scripture. Altitude is life insurance. Speed is life. They were told to forget everything they had learned about dogfighting. Forget turning inside the enemy. Forget circling for position. The Lightning did not fight horizontally. It fought by climbing above the Zero's world, striking from a steep dive, firing at long range with nose-mounted weapons, climbing away before the Zero could respond. This wasn't evolution, it was revolution. Japan perfected horizontal war. America was about to introduce vertical war. On December 27, 1942, Coast Watchers transmitted a message. Major Japanese formation inbound to Buna. 40 aircraft, fighter escort, 30 minutes to intercept. To Lynch, the meaning was clear. A Japanese strike group at predictable altitude, unaware that P-38s were now operational. He issued the order. All Lightnings scramble. Hold your altitude. Do not turn with the Zero. On the airstrip, 12 P-38s came alive. 24 Allison engines roared in unison. Turbo superchargers screamed as the Lightnings accelerated down the runway. Among the pilots was a quiet young lieutenant, Richard Bong. Minutes later, he would score the first victories of a legendary career. As the P-38s lifted off, Lynch pointed his aircraft upward and began a steady climb. 18,000 feet, where the Zero began to lose power. 20,000 feet, where P-40 struggled to fight. 24,000 feet, where Japanese pilots rarely operated. 26,000 feet, a world the Zero could not reach. Below them, the coastline of Buna curved into the sea. Far in the distance, tiny specks, Japanese aircraft, were rising slowly toward their bombing altitude. Lynch's voice came through the radio, low and precise. Hold altitude. We strike on my mark. For more than a year, Japanese pilots had possessed absolute confidence. Their tactics worked every time. Their aircraft dominated every battle. Their veterans were among the finest in the world. But confidence is dangerous when the battlefield changes. When they finally spotted the glints of the P-38s above them, the realization hit instantly. They were no longer the masters of the sky. Lynch rolled his aircraft over and pushed the nose down. The dive began. 300 miles per hour, 350 miles per hour, 400 miles per hour. The P-38 remained stable, powerful, calm. Below, the Zero pilots still had no idea what was coming. They were flying the same escort pattern they had flown for months, waiting for American fighters to climb sluggishly into the fight. Instead, death was falling from the sun. Within seconds, the first Lightning opened fire. Within minutes, a new era of air combat began. The Japanese formation approached Buna in perfect order. Fighters above, dive bombers below, maintaining the same disciplined pattern that had crushed every Allied defense since 1941. To them, this mission felt routine. They had flown it dozens of times and the outcome rarely changed. But that morning, something was different. High above them, so high that no Zero pilot bothered to look, 12 P-38 Lightnings held their silence. The Americans watched every movement of the Japanese formation from a realm the Zero could not reach. An altitude that turned confidence into vulnerability. When the command finally came from Lynch, the tone said everything. Lightning flight, dive. In the next instant, the Pacific sky split open. Lynch pushed his aircraft into a steep descent, the cockpit vibrating gently as airspeed surged. Behind him, 11 more P-38s rolled in, their twin tails slicing the sunlight as they dropped toward the Japanese like falling steel. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400, 425. The Lightning remained solid, responsive, calm, designed for this exact moment. Below, the Japanese pilots began to notice dark shapes growing larger in the sky. At first, they assumed they were bombers, or reconnaissance craft, or anything except fighters capable of diving faster than a Zero could withstand. Then the leading P-38 opened fire. A concentrated, steady burst of cannon and machine gun fire reached out from nearly 400 yards. a range unimaginable to Zero pilots whose wing-mounted guns required tight, close-in convergence. The first Oscar disintegrated before its pilot understood he was under attack. Richard Bong, still in the early days of his combat career, followed Lynch into the storm. He selected a Zero turning toward Lynch's climb-out and gently tightened his trigger pressure. A short burst. Flames erupted from the enemy's engine. The Zero rolled away, trailing black smoke, falling toward the jungle below. Bong had his first kill. Seconds later, 3 more Zeros locked onto him, attempting to pull him into a turning fight, the same trap that had ended so many American pilots. But Bong refused the instinct. He shoved the throttles forward and dove. The Zero pilots attempted to follow. 380 miles per hour. Vibration. 400 miles per hour. Structural limits. 420 miles per hour. The first wing snapped. One pilot pulled up just in time. His wingman didn't. Bong leveled out above the canopy, spotted a Valdive bomber recovering from its attack run, and fired from 100 yards. The aircraft exploded into the trees in a ball of flame. His second kill. His initiation into a new kind of air war. Within minutes, the Japanese formation dissolved into confusion. Zeros scattered in every direction, unable to climb into the fight, unable to dive away safely, unable to find the Americans who struck and vanished like ghosts. From above, the battle looked nothing like the dogfights that once ruled the Pacific. There were no turning circles, no weaving duels, no prolonged engagements, only vertical slashes, lightning-fast dives, distant bursts of fire, aircraft breaking apart, and Americans climbing back through empty sky before the Japanese could respond. It was the birth of vertical warfare, and Japan had no defense. Lieutenant Karl Planck, flying on the edge of the formation, found a Zero trying to climb after Lynch's retreating Lightning. He positioned his gun sight, held steady at long range, and fired. At 400 yards, the Zero rolled inverted and fell straight into the sea. For a Japanese pilot trained to fight tight, precise, horizontal engagements, dying to an unseen attacker from hundreds of yards away felt like a nightmare. They were losing a battle they couldn't even properly see. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. When Lynch finally called, "Break off! Reform at altitude!" The result was absolute: 12 Japanese aircraft destroyed, no P-38 damaged, 3 American pilots recording kills, 0 intercept attempts successful. It wasn't a dogfight, it was a demonstration. The Zero, once the hunter, had become prey. That 9-minute battle forced Japanese command to confront a truth they had avoided for months. The Zero no longer controlled the Pacific sky. Survivors returned to Rabaul shaken, providing reports unlike any previously recorded. They spoke of aircraft that attacked from impossible heights, of guns that killed from impossible ranges, of dives that no Zero could follow, of climbs that defied everything they had learned. One pilot wrote, "The American aircraft refused to fight. It struck and vanished. There was no answer." For Japan, this was more than a tactical setback. It was the collapse of an entire doctrine. The turning fight, the foundation of Japanese air superiority, was dead. On the American side, the victory was not celebrated loudly. Pilots walked back to their tents exhausted, processing the shock of seeing a plan work exactly as designed. They had proof, real proof, that holding altitude worked. Long-range firepower worked. Refusing horizontal combat worked. The P-38 was not just another fighter, it was a weapon system. For the first time, American pilots felt something new. Control. Not hope, not luck. Control. They could now decide when to fight, how to fight, and whether to fight at all. And that changed everything that followed in the Solomon Islands. Tran Buna Khong Chila Chien Thang Jiao Tien Kua Pi Batam. It was the moment Japanese air superiority cracked. American confidence returned. Vertical warfare proved itself. Veteran Zero pilots realized they could not adapt fast enough. The Pacific Air War did not end that morning, but it turned. In 9 minutes, the balance of power shifted. In 9 minutes, Japanese dominance revealed its limits. In 9 minutes, the P-38 Lightning announced itself as the new architect of the sky, and nothing in the Pacific would ever be the same again. The news of the Buna engagement spread through Japanese units faster than any formal report. What unsettled them was not simply the number of aircraft lost. What terrified them was the way the battle had unfolded. Silent, vertical, uncontestable. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese pilots felt something deeper than danger. They felt inevitability. In the weeks after Buna, the twin-boom silhouette appeared more often in the sky. At first as isolated encounters, then as full squadrons, then as the dominant escort fighter across the entire front line. Japan's experienced pilots understood what this meant long before their commanders did. A new kind of enemy had arrived, and it was built to erase their strengths. Japanese fighter doctrine had been crafted over years of brutal experience in China. Everything revolved around the turn, the tightest circle, the cleanest angle, the quickest roll. It was a doctrine shaped by men who had trusted the Zero with their lives, and the Zero had repaid them with unmatched victories. But in early 1943, something horrifying became clear. The P-38 refused to fight in the horizontal plane. Zero pilots tried to force the engagement downward. The P-38 simply climbed away. They attempted to lure it into a turn. It stayed outside the circle and struck from above. They tried to escape in a dive. Their aircraft shook apart before reaching the lightning speed. The battle space they had mastered was gone. A new one had taken its place. A vertical world where Japanese tactics were meaningless. As more Lightning squadrons arrived, the 49th, the 8010th, and soon the 475th, the Americans refined their doctrine to a terrifying precision. They flew in stacked formations, lead elements at 26,000 feet, cover elements at 28,000 feet, strike elements ready to dive as a coordinated wave. Japanese formations, rising predictably toward bomber altitude, found themselves entering a kill box they could neither see nor escape. From the ground, observers described the scene. The sky looked empty. Then the lightnings came down like a storm. Amid this transformation stood Richard Bong, whose instincts aligned perfectly with the Lightning's design. He mastered long-range deflection shooting, energy retention in every maneuver, the discipline to avoid horizontal temptation, the art of selecting targets from perfect altitude. By mid-1943, his reputation grew. By late 1943, it became myth. Pilots spoke of his uncanny ability to fire a 1-second burst that tore a Zero apart. Others remembered how he climbed after every attack with effortless precision, as if the rules of gravity did not apply to him. In one engagement over Hollandia, Bong shot down 3 Japanese fighters in under 5 minutes. He did it by following the same pattern every time. Climb high, dive once, fire precisely, leave instantly. This was not the air war Japan had prepared for. While Bong became the symbol of deadly precision, Thomas Maguire became the architect of a modern air combat manual. He refined the Maguire roll, a high-speed barrel maneuver that preserved energy while maintaining sight. The vertical reverse, allowing a Lightning to swap positions with a pursuing enemy. Coordinated vertical scissors, trapping Japanese fighters between multiple attackers. His written manual, Combat Tactics in the Southwest Pacific Area, turned Lightning escorts into a synchronized killing machine. Maguire understood something fundamental. The Zero could never win if the battle stayed vertical. He built an entire strategy around that truth. By early 1943, the Japanese air arm faced an enemy far more destructive than the P-38, Attrition. Veteran pilots, the elite corps who had carried Japan across the Pacific, died faster than they could be replaced. Consider the numbers. Training time dropped from 24 months to 6 months. Flight hours dropped from 700 plus to less than 100. Many replacements had never flown above 20,000 feet. Some had never fired guns in real air combat conditions. These new aviators were expected to fly against men like Bong and Maguire, pilots with hundreds of hours in a fighter that outperformed theirs in every category that mattered. It wasn't a contest, it was a countdown. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943 exposed the full consequences of this imbalance. A major Japanese convoy attempted to reinforce Leh. They had air cover, Zero-sen pilots with experience, determination, and a mission they believed they could fulfill. But above them, the P-38s waited. When the attack began, Zero escorts were shredded in vertical slashing strikes. Bombers were torn apart before reaching escape altitude. The convoy was devastated. 8 transports and 4 destroyers lost. After that battle, a Japanese officer recorded, We no longer have the ability to protect our own ships. The psychological blow was worse than the material one. Facing an enemy they couldn't outrun, outclimb, or outgun, Japanese pilots tried everything they could imagine, diving into clouds to break contact, flying low to force Americans to engage at disadvantage, waiting in ambush below cloud layers, attempting feint climbs to bait P-38s into horizontal fights. Nothing worked. The P-38 pilot always had a choice. The Zero pilot never did. This imbalance carved a permanent truth into the minds of Japanese aviators. They were fighting a war the Lightning had already solved. The Japanese aviation ethos valued courage above everything. Skill could be taught, discipline could be drilled, but spirit, seishin, was the soul of a pilot. The P-38 confronted them with an enemy that courage could not overcome. Letters recovered after island battles contained lines like, "I scan the sun every second. That is where death lives now. The twin-tailed demon comes from the heights. I dream of it. I cannot escape it." These were words Japan had never expected its pilots to write. Despite their rising kill counts, American pilots were not triumphant. They were exhausted. Flying the P-38 meant missions of 6 to 8 hours, constant management of engines, heat, and turbochargers, long-range escort routes over open ocean, battles starting and ending within seconds, returning to base drained, mentally and physically. They lived with a quiet truth that dominance does not make war easier. It only makes survival more likely. This was the hell within, the grinding, relentless reality beneath the Lightning's rising legend. By mid-1943, the change was irreversible. American pilots no longer feared the Zero. Japanese pilots no longer expected victory. Vertical warfare had replaced horizontal duels. Attrition had replaced parity. Technology had replaced tradition. The Lightning was not just a weapon. It was the tool that reshaped the Pacific Air War. Slowly, relentlessly, inevitably, and deep inside each pilot, American and Japanese alike. A truth grew heavier with every mission. The sky itself had changed. Word of the Buna engagement traveled faster than official reports could be written. It wasn't the 12 Japanese aircraft lost that shook command at Rabaul. Losses were expected in war. What shook them was how those losses occurred. There had been no prolonged dogfight, no American losses, no chance for Zero pilots to use the tactics that defined their dominance. One pilot who survived described it simply, "We never had the chance to fight." For Japan, the Buna encounter was not a tactical failure. It was the first clear sign that the balance of air power had shifted, and that the skies they once owned might no longer belong to them. For more than a year, Japanese air supremacy was built on a simple formula: a light airframe, a tight turn radius, exceptional agility, and aggressive horizontal tactics. This formula had carried them from Pearl Harbor to the jungles of New Guinea. It worked flawlessly against P-39s and P-40. But after Buna, something obvious and terrifying became clear. Horizontal combat was dead. Zero pilots attempted to force P-38s into turning battles. The Lightnings refused. They tried to climb into the American attack runs. The P-38 stayed far above their ceiling. They tried to dive away. Their aircraft shook violently, reaching structural limits long before the Lightning. Every instinct they relied on became useless. Every maneuver they practiced failed. The battlefield they mastered, a world of circles, rolls, and tight turns, had been replaced by a vertical arena where they were powerless. Between January and February 1943, headquarters issued new tactical orders. Do not engage P-38s above 15,000 feet. Do not pursue a diving Lightning. Engage only with numerical superiority of 3 to 1. Avoid combat with P-38 formations whenever possible. These were not tactical guidelines. They were warnings of helplessness. The Zero could not climb. It could not dive. It could not disengage. The Lightning dictated everything. After Buna, more P-38 units arrived. The 49th Fighter Group, the 85th Fighter Squadron, the 475th Fighter Group built entirely around the Lightning. Each unit arrived with refined tactics and battle-proven discipline. Every group trained to fight vertically, strike as a coordinated mass, and never slip into the Zero's domain. From New Guinea to the Solomons, P-38s became the hunters of the Pacific sky. In March 1943, Japan sent a major convoy to reinforce Leh. It sailed under the belief that air cover, long trusted, could protect it. But when the P-38s arrived, Zero escorts were overwhelmed. Bombers were destroyed before reaching their attack profiles. 8 transports and 4 destroyers were lost. It was the moment Allied commanders understood. The Lightning was not merely a fighter, it was a strategic weapon. And Japanese commanders realized they no longer had the ability to defend their own forces. After Buna, Bong continued perfecting the Lightning's doctrine. His shooting accuracy became legendary. His discipline in maintaining altitude became instinct. By mid-1944, he surpassed Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. By the end, he reached 40 confirmed kills, everyone with the P-38. A Japanese pilot once said, "When the twin booms appeared, we knew Bong was there." McGuire turned combat experience into a precise science. He designed maneuvers that maximized the P-38's natural advantages. The McGuire roll, the vertical reverse, coordinated vertical scissors. His later manual became mandatory reading across the 5th Air Force. His final score, 38 victories, was more than a personal achievement. It was proof that P-38 doctrine was not luck, but system. Japan had no time, no training pipeline, and no machines capable of matching it. Between late 1942 and late 1943, Japan suffered losses it could not replace. 70% of pilots in multiple air groups, 80% of aircraft in certain frontline units, critical shortages in fuel, spare parts, and trained mechanics. America, meanwhile, had pilots with 300 to 500 hours before arriving in combat, abundant aircraft replacement, a growing number of Lightning squadrons. Industrial support Japan could not hope to match. A Japanese pilot wrote shortly before his death, "We do not lose for lack of courage. We lose because the new war has left us behind." On April 18, 1943, American intelligence decoded Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's travel route. Only one fighter had the range to strike him, the P-38. 16 Lightnings flew low for more than 400 miles, navigating open ocean with absolute precision. They intercepted his formation exactly on schedule. Both Betty bombers were shot down. Yamamoto was killed instantly. Every P-38 returned home. At Rabaul, one stunned officer whispered, "If even the combined fleet's commander cannot be protected, then none of us can." This was not just a military loss, it was a psychological collapse. From late 1943 onward, P-38s escorted bombers with increasing range. Zeros struggled to reach combat altitude. Japan's defense became reactive and desperate. Engagements grew more one-sided. By the Philippines campaign, Zero formations were being destroyed entirely in single engagements. Some units resorted to suicide tactics, not out of ideology, but because conventional combat had become impossible. They were skilled, disciplined, and courageous. No historian denies this, but they were trapped in a doctrine that belonged to another war. One fought in circles, in low-altitude knife fights, with machines built for agility instead of energy. The P-38 forced them into a battlefield where skill alone could not win. They adapted. They learned. They embraced technology, logistics, and industrial scale. The P-38 was more than a fighter. It was a symbol of a new approach to war: altitude, speed, firepower, and range, combined through doctrine. The first clash at Buna marked the end of Zero dominance, the rise of vertical warfare, the return of American air superiority, the foundation of modern fighter doctrine. Every jet fighter that came after, F-86, F-4, F-15, F-22, traces its lineage to the energy-based combat introduced by the Lightning. Buna was not a battle, it was a transformation. By war's end, wrecked airframes, Zeros, Lightnings, Betty bombers, lay scattered across islands from New Guinea to the Philippines. Rusted metal and broken engines, half buried in mud and mangrove, still whisper the story of that transition. A former Japanese ace said long after the war, "The Lightning made us understand we were no longer the hunters." A former American pilot, remembering the P-38, said, "It gave us the sky back." Between those two truths lies the story of how the Pacific Air War ended. and how a twin-boomed fighter rewrote the rules of combat forever.